The metallic click of a gun being cocked split the Colorado air like thunder. Maria Volkov knelt in the dust, her wrists bound with rope that had already drawn blood, staring down the barrel of Cyrus Black's revolver. The weapon gleamed in the merciless afternoon sun, its muzzle steady as death itself aimed directly at her heart. "You know what I love about foreign girls." Cyrus drawled his pale eyes, never leaving Maria's face, as the crowd of townspeople shifted nervously around them. "They always think they're special, think their stories matter more than the coin in my pocket." A child in the crowd, no more than 8 years old, suddenly broke free from his mother's grasp. "Don't hurt the lady," he cried, his small voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. His mother lunged forward, snatching him back with terror-filled eyes, but the moment of interruption sent a ripple of unease through the gathered witnesses. Cyrus's finger tightened on the trigger, his smile turning predatory. Touching. Real touching. But business is business. Maria's green eyes blazed with defiance, despite the terror clawing at her chest. Her right hand instinctively found the small silver bracelet hidden beneath her torn sleeve. Anna's bracelet, the last gift her sister had pressed into her palm as she lay dying in that cramped New York tenement. "Find freedom, little sparrow," Anna had whispered through lips flecked with blood from the factory dust that had destroyed her lungs. "Whatever it costs. Don't let them cage you like they caged me." The memory blazed through Maria's mind, as bright as summer lightning. Anna's calloused fingers tracing the tiny sparrow charm on the bracelet. Anna's voice still strong despite her failing body. "This bird belonged to our grandmother back in the old country. She said it carried the souls of women who died free. Wear it. Remember that freedom is worth dying for. The last chance, girl." Cyrus set his finger tightening on the trigger. "You can come quiet or you can fertilize this worthless dirt. Makes no difference to me." The gathered crowd watched in tense silence. Farmers, shopkeepers, their wives, clutching children's hands. In the distance, smoke from a forgotten lantern began to curl upward near the barn, a thin gray finger pointing toward the Colorado sky like an accusation. Helen Harrow stood on her porch, weathered hands, gripping the railing until her knuckles went white. Something flickered behind her steel-gray eyes, not just the brittle authority of survival, but a flash of recognition, as if she saw her younger self kneeling in that same dust decades ago. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain and the distant promise of fire. Maria raised her head, meeting Cyrus's gaze directly, her fingers tightening around Anna's bracelet. "Go to hell." Cyrus smiled like a wolf. "After you." But before he could pull the trigger, the child broke free again, this time throwing himself directly at Cyrus's horse. The animal reared, spooked by the sudden movement, and the shot went wide, the bullet shattering a window in Helen's house instead of Maria's heart. 4 months earlier, Maria had stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Bitter Creek, with nothing but a worn carpet bag and Anna's bracelet wrapped around her wrist. The matrimonial agency's letters had painted pictures of domestic bliss, kind husband, comfortable home, children playing in sunlit gardens. Reality was a collection of weathered buildings that looked assembled from broken dreams. "You, the Volkov girl." Helen Harrow's voice cut through the late summer heat. She stood in the farmhouse doorway, measuring Maria with calculating eyes. Smaller than expected. The Harrow farm squatted on Bitter Creek's outskirts like an open wound. Peeling paint hung from the main house in leprous strips, and surrounding buildings sagged under accumulated failures. Colorado Territory in 1878 was harsh country for dreamers. John Harrow emerged from the barn, tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and trembling hands. At 35, he carried himself with false confidence of a man balanced on ruin's edge. When his eyes met Maria's, she saw hunger not for love, but for the respectability he believed a wife might provide. "Agency said you could read." He glanced nervously at Helen. "Ma needs help with the books." Sarah Harrow was 19 with gentle spirits that seemed criminal in this harsh place. She possessed their father's kind eyes and their mother's stubborn chin, but where Helen had grown bitter, Sarah remained hopeful. Her seamstress work brought the family's only steady income. "Ma doesn't mean to be harsh," Sarah whispered during their first private moment. "Life ain't been kind to women in this family." The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later in the dusty yard. Reverend Mills mumbled through the service with obvious discomfort, eyes darting between bride and groom like a man expecting trouble. No flowers, no music, no celebration, just a legal contract binding Maria to a fate she was beginning to understand might be worse than the factory death she'd fled. That first night alone in the cramped attic room Helen had assigned her, Maria heard voices drifting through floorboards. Mother and son argued in whispers about money debts, men who came asking questions. "She's pretty enough," Helen was saying. "That should count for something when the time comes. Pretty don't pay what I owe, and Cyrus ain't known for patience." Maria pulled her thin blanket closer, staring through the small window at endless prairie stretching toward distant mountains. Bitter Creek's lights twinkled below 200 souls, trying to squeeze life from unforgiving land. She learned this during her few ventures to town. Women whispered when she passed, and men looked at her with pity and speculation that made her skin crawl. Foreign-born with an accent, marking her as different in Bitter Creek, different was dangerous, but there were small kindnesses. Sarah would slip her extra food when Helen wasn't looking. Fletcher Morrison, the aging rancher, whose property bordered theirs, tipped his hat when their paths crossed. Dr. Benjamin Hayes nodded politely when she accompanied Sarah for medicine. It was during one such trip that Maria first saw Talon Little Raven. He was working on the general store roof, long black hair tied with leather cord movements, efficient and sure, as he replaced damaged shingles. When he noticed her looking, he paused and met her gaze directly, something few people in Bitter Creek had done since her arrival. Talon was Lakota, one of perhaps a dozen Native Americans who lived and worked in the area, despite obvious hostility. At 28, he was tall and lean, with intelligent dark eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest labor. His father had died in a cavalry skirmish 10 years earlier, his mother from influenza the following winter. "Who's that man?" Maria asked Sarah. "That's Talon," Sarah replied, glancing around nervously. "He's decent enough, but Ma says we shouldn't truck with his kind." Something in Talon's direct gaze had struck her. It was the look of someone who understood what it meant to be an outsider, judged not for who you were, but what others perceived you to be. Days at the Harrow farm settled into grim routine. Maria rose before dawn for cooking, and cleaning spent daylight tending the struggling garden, and few chickens Helen kept, and fell into bed exhausted each night. Helen watched her every move with suspicious eyes. "I think you're better than us," Helen would say, voice dripping venom, "with your fancy Eastern ways and foreign tongue. But you ain't nothing special." John alternated between ignoring Maria completely and making awkward conversation that devolved into complaints about his troubles. He drank more each night, and when he drank, his temper shortened and his hands grew heavier. Maria learned to read the signs and became expert at invisibility when storms approached. Evening family gatherings in the parlor revealed glimpses of Helen's true hunger. She'd read letters from relatives back east, dinner parties, theater performances, new dresses. Helen would read with physical hunger, her voice growing wistful before hardening into bitterness. "Could have had all that," she'd say, looking directly at Maria, "if I hadn't been fool enough to believe in promises." It was during these sessions that Maria began understanding her predicament's true scope. Helen spoke in code about debts needing payment, men asking questions, arrangements requiring honor. The message was clear. Maria wasn't just a wife, she was an asset to be sold when debts came due. The knowledge settled in her stomach like cold stone. She began watching the horizon more carefully. The drought continued, debts mounted, and Maria felt her invisible prison walls growing higher each day. But beyond the failing crops, an endless dust storm clouds were gathering. Change was coming to Bitter Creek, whether its residents were ready or not. The morning everything changed began with hoofbeats drumming against hard-packed earth like gunshots. Maria paused at the kitchen window, something in the rhythm making her blood run cold. Too early for casual visitors. Too desperate for good news. 3 riders thundered into the yard, horses lathered with sweat clothes covered in trail dust. The man in the lead was tall and thin, dressed in a black coat with pale eyes that cataloged everything they touched. Even before John stumbled from the house, face white with terror, Maria knew who had arrived. Cyrus Black had come to collect. Cyrus. John's voice barely rose above a whisper. We weren't. That is, debts don't wait for convenience. Cyrus's voice carried soft menace of a man who'd learned whispers terrorized more effectively than shouts. And you've been avoiding my letters. Maria pressed herself against the kitchen wall, heart hammering. Through the window, she could see Sarah in the barn doorway, face pale with growing understanding. Helen emerged from the house, stepping forward with desperate bravado. We have the money, most of it. Just need more time. Cyrus laughed like breaking glass. Time's up, Helen. You know our arrangement. 5 girls over the years, and I paid you well for each. But then you got greedy, started keeping the pretty ones for family use. The words hit Maria like physical blows as pieces fell into place. The matrimonial agency carefully worded letters, Helen's appraising look, that first day, all lies. She wasn't a mail-order bride. She was merchandise. She's John's wife now. Helen said, voice lacking conviction. Legal and proper. I can do whatever I want. Your son owes me $800 plus interest. That's more than this dirt farm will see in 5 years. John made a sound that might have been sob or laugh. She ain't worth $800, Cyrus. Look at her small foreign. Nobody's gonna pay premium for damaged goods. That's not your concern. Your concern is settling your debt. Maria sank to her knees behind the window, mind reeling. She wasn't the first girl brought here under false pretenses. There had been others, 5 others, all sold like cattle when debts came due. Tonight, she heard Cyrus saying, I'll be back tonight and we'll finish this business. The sound of departing horses brought Maria back to the present. She realized she was crying not quiet tears she'd learned to shed in silence, but great racking sobs from somewhere deep in her chest. What are you doing? Helen's voice cut through her grief. Maria looked up to find the older woman standing in the doorway, face twisted with rage and something that might have been shame. Behind her, John lurked in shadows. You were listening. Helen stepped forward, heard everything. No point denying it. Maria struggled to her feet, wiping her eyes. How many girls have you sold? Helen's face cycled through expressions, anger, defiance, finally, something approaching regret. It ain't what you think. We gave them homes, husbands. They were better off as slaves. The word hung between them, like a challenge. Helen stepped forward, hand raised as if to strike, but something in Maria's eyes stopped her. You don't understand, Helen said, voice cracking. You don't know what it's like to have nothing be nothing. I was married off to a man who used me like livestock, then left me with nothing but debts and children to feed. And now you'll do the same to me. Yes, Helen said simply. Because that's how the world works. Someone has to pay. Maria felt something break inside her chest, some last vestige of hope she hadn't known she still carried. She looked at John, still hiding in shadows. Sarah, she said suddenly. Does Sarah know? Helen's face hardened. Sarah's none of your concern. She's a good girl. Nothing like me. Nothing like the other girls you sold. That's enough. John finally found his voice. It's done. There's always a choice, Maria said, surprised by her voice's steadiness. Could we? Helen asked, and for a moment her mask slipped completely, revealing the broken woman beneath. You think I wanted this? I was trapped just like you. Only difference is, I learned to trap others before they could trap me. The admission hit Maria like a physical blow. She saw Helen clearly for the first time, not as a monster, but as another victim of the same system. It didn't excuse what Helen had done, but it explained it. There has to be another way. There is no other way, Helen replied. Not for people like us, not for women with no money, no family, no power. But as the words left her mouth, Maria was already thinking about the cost, not just to herself, but to the other girls who had stood in this kitchen, had this conversation, made this terrible discovery. Through the window, she could see Sarah returning from the barn, arms full of eggs, and face still pale with worry. She didn't know. Sarah didn't know what her family had become. I won't let you destroy her too, Maria said. Helen followed her gaze, expression softening momentarily. Sarah's different. Sarah's good. Not if I can help it. The two women stared at each other across the kitchen, and Maria realized that in some strange way, they understood each other perfectly. Both trapped, both desperate, both willing to do whatever it took to protect what they cared about. The only difference was that Helen had surrendered hope, while Maria was just beginning to fight. Cyrus will be back tonight, Helen said finally. I suggest you make your peace with what's happening. I'll fight, Maria said simply, until I can't fight anymore. Helen nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. Then you'll die fighting, because that's the only choice women like us really have. As Helen turned to leave, Maria caught her arm. The other girls, where are they now? Helen's face went completely blank. I don't know. I stopped asking those questions long ago. But Maria could see the truth in her eyes. Helen did knew, and tried not to think about it. Just as she tried not to think about what would happen to Maria. After Helen left, Maria stood alone in the kitchen, listening to her own heartbeat and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The sun shone through the window, and for a moment, everything seemed almost normal. But normal was an illusion, and illusions were luxuries Maria could no longer afford. Tonight, Cyrus Black would return, and her life would change forever. The question was whether she would face that change as victim or fighter. She thought of the other girls, whose names she'd never know, whose faces she'd never see. They had stood in this kitchen, felt this fear, faced this impossible choice. Some had given up. Some had fought and lost. But Maria was still here, still standing, still breathing. And as long as she was breathing, there was hope, even if she was the only one who believed it. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Maria worked in the vegetable garden, hands moving automatically among struggling plants while her mind raced through possibilities. Every escape plan crumbled under reality's weight. No money, no horse, no knowledge of surrounding territory. Sarah appeared at the garden gate, sewing basket in hand, and face creased with worry. Ma sent me to fetch you. Says you need to prepare yourself for tonight. Maria looked up from withered tomato plants, dirt streaking her face. Sarah, what do you know about the other women who've lived here? Sarah's face paled. Other women. The ones before me. The mail-order brides. Sarah's hands tightened on her basket until knuckles went white. There was Mary 2 years ago. Stayed about 6 months, then said she had to go back east, 'cause her mother was sick. And before her, Elena. She trailed off, eyes widening with understanding. They didn't go back east, did they? Sarah shook her head, slowly tears forming. Where did they go? I don't know, Maria said truthfully. But I know they were sold just like I'm going to be sold tonight. The sewing basket fell spilling thread and needles across dusty ground. No, Sarah whispered. Ma wouldn't. Your mother was young once too. Maria said, moving closer to the fence separating them. She was trapped just like we are now. But instead of finding a way to break free, she became part of the trap. Sarah was crying openly now, whole body shaking. I should have known, should have seen the signs. You couldn't have known because you didn't want to know, Maria said. That's not your fault. But now you do know, and you have a choice. What choice? Help me or let this happen, and spend the rest of your life wondering what became of me. Sarah wiped her eyes, leaving dirt streaks across her cheeks. What can I do? I'm nobody. You have more power than you think, Maria said. You know this town, these people. And you have something I don't, freedom to move around without being watched every second. What do you need? Maria glanced toward the house where Helen was visible through the kitchen window. There's a man in town, a Lakota named Talon. He works odd jobs, lives in a cabin near the reservation. I need you to find him and give him a message. What message? Tell him what's happening here. Tell him about Cyrus Black and the other girls. Tell him... Maria paused, searching for the right words. Tell him someone needs help, and helping might be the right thing to do, even if it's dangerous. Sarah nodded, tears still falling, but jaw set with determination. I'll find him. After Sarah left, Maria returned to her garden work, but her thoughts were far from struggling vegetables. She thought about Fletcher Morrison, who'd always been kind, and Dr. Hayes, who treated small injuries without questions. She thought about Sheriff Bradley, who might be corrupt, but probably wasn't evil. Most of all, she thought about Talon Little Raven, the man who'd met her gaze directly when everyone else looked away. There had been something in his eyes that day, recognition perhaps, or understanding of what it meant to be an outsider. As afternoon wore on, Maria noticed increased activity around the farm. John had disappeared after lunch, returning with a whiskey bottle he began attacking with grim determination. Helen moved through the house like a woman preparing for a funeral. The air was thick with tension. Around 4 o'clock, Fletcher Morrison rode into the yard, weathered face creased with concern. Maria watched from the kitchen window as he spoke quietly with Helen on the front porch. Voices too low to hear, but body language speaking volumes. Get away from that window. Helen snapped, appearing suddenly in the doorway. Fletcher's here on business that don't concern you. But as Maria moved away, she caught Fletcher's eye through the glass. The old rancher's expression was troubled, and he shook his head slowly, as if disappointed by whatever Helen had told him. What did Mr. Morrison want? Maria asked. None of your business, Helen replied, but her voice lacked usual venom. She seemed distracted, almost uncertain. He was asking about me, wasn't he? Helen whirled around, eyes blazing. Think you're so smart. Think you can figure out our secrets and turn people against us. Well, let me tell you something, Fletcher Morrison's got problems of his own. But even as she spoke, Maria could see doubt in Helen's eyes. Fletcher's visit had unsettled her, and that gave Maria a small spark of hope. The sun was beginning to set when Sarah finally returned, face flushed with exertion and hair disheveled from riding. She'd borrowed a horse from the neighbor's farm, claiming she needed to run errands in town. Did you find him? Maria asked quietly as Sarah passed through the kitchen. Sarah nodded slightly, not daring to speak with Helen so close by. But something in her expression told Maria the message had been delivered. As darkness fell, tension in the house became almost unbearable. John had finished his bottle and started another speech, slurred, and movements increasingly unsteady. Helen sat in the parlor, reading the same Bible page over and over, lips moving silently as if in prayer. Sarah had retreated to her room, claiming a headache. At precisely 9 o'clock, the sound of horses in the yard announced Cyrus Black's return. This time, he'd brought more men. Maria counted at least 5 riders through the kitchen window. They were hard-looking men who made their living from others' misery. Showtime, Helen said grimly, rising from her chair. Remember what I told you. But Maria had no intention of making things easy. As Helen moved toward the door to greet their visitors, Maria slipped quietly up the back stairs to her attic room. From her small window, she could see the men in the yard below, faces illuminated by torchlight. Cyrus was giving orders, pointing toward the house and surrounding buildings. Two of his men began circling the property, checking for escape routes. They were professionals, Maria realized. This wasn't their first time collecting human merchandise, and they'd learned to be thorough. But professionalism could breed overconfidence. As she watched a shadow move near the barn, a figure that seemed to separate from darkness and glide silently between buildings, Maria's heart leaped as she recognized the lean form and graceful movement. Talon had come. A few minutes later, footsteps echoed on the stairs. Helen's voice called out, "Time to go, Maria. Don't make this harder than it has to be." But when Helen reached the attic room, she found it empty. The window was open, and a rope made from torn bed sheets hung from the sill, disappearing into darkness below. Maria Volkov had chosen to fight. The rope burned Maria's hands as she lowered herself from the attic window feet, scrambling against rough wooden siding. The distance to the ground seemed impossibly far, and every creak of the makeshift rope sounded like gunshots in the still night air. Her feet touched ground just as a shout erupted from the house above. "She's gone. The girl's gone." Maria didn't wait. She sprinted toward the barn, heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. Darkness was both ally and enemy, concealing her movement but hiding obstacles. She stumbled over a bucket, metal clanging against hard-packed earth. "Whither?" one of Cyrus's men shouted. "By the barn." Running footsteps followed her along with jingling spurs and harsh breathing of men who made their living chasing down runaway girls. Maria reached the barn and pressed herself against its weathered wall. "Maria." The voice came from shadows near the building's corner, low and urgent. "This way." Talon stepped into view, dark hair loose around shoulders and eyes reflecting starlight. He was dressed in dark clothes that made him nearly invisible in the night. "How did you—" Maria began, but he cut her off with a gesture. "Sarah found me," he said simply. "Told me what was happening. We need to move. Now." Behind them, sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Cyrus's voice could be heard barking orders, and torchlight glow was beginning to illuminate the area around the house. "This way," Talon said, leading her toward the barn's back. "There's an old trail. My ancestors used it to avoid the cavalry. It leads through hidden valleys to the sacred caves in the high country." They moved through darkness, Talon's sure steps, guiding Maria around obstacles she couldn't see. The moon was only a sliver, providing little light, but somehow he seemed to know exactly where he was going. "They're spreading out to search," Talon whispered as they reached a small rise behind the barn. "Cyrus knows this area, but he doesn't know the old ways." "How do you know about Cyrus?" Maria asked, breathing hard from their sprint. My people hear things," Talon replied grimly. "We know about girls who disappear, ones sold to mining camps and brothels across the territory. The spirits of our grandmothers cry out for justice." As he spoke, Talon paused beside a large boulder and placed his palm flat against its surface. He closed his eyes for a moment, lips moving silently in what Maria realized was a prayer or ritual. When he opened his eyes again, and there was a new determination in his gaze. "The earth remembers all who suffer upon it," he said quietly. "Tonight we run the Freedom Trail." They began descending toward what Maria had thought was just another hill. But as they got closer, she realized Talon was leading her toward what looked like a crack in the earth itself. A narrow canyon she never would have noticed in daylight. "The spirits guide us," Talon said as they approached the hidden entrance. "This path has carried many to safety." But just as they reached the canyon's mouth, a voice called out from behind them. "I know you're out there, girl." Cyrus's voice carried clearly across the night air. "You can run, but you can't hide forever. And when I catch you, and I will catch you, things are going to go much harder." The sound of horses splashing through creek water upstream announced their pursuers had found their trail. Without another word, both plunged into the narrow canyon, following what felt like an ancient path, worn smooth by countless feet. The canyon walls rose high above them, blocking out most of the starlight and creating a tunnel of darkness. But Talon moved with confidence, one hand trailing along the rock wall, as if following a guide only he could feel. "My grandfather brought me here as a boy," he said quietly. "Taught me the old stories. This place is sacred. The walls remember every soul who sought freedom here." They had gone perhaps half a mile when Talon suddenly grabbed Maria's arm and pulled her into a shallow alcove carved into the canyon wall. "Riders," he whispered, though Maria couldn't hear anything. Moments later, the sound of horses echoing off canyon walls reached her ears. Torchlight began to flicker in the distance, growing brighter as their pursuers entered the narrow passage. "Now there," one of the riders called out, voice carrying clearly in the confined space. "Fresh tracks in the sand." "About time," came another voice. "Cyrus is getting impatient." Maria pressed herself against the cold stone, feeling rough rock through her thin dress. Beside her, Talon was completely motionless, breathing so controlled she could barely detect it. The torchlight was getting closer. "Check every alcove," the first rider ordered. "If they came this way, they're trapped. Canyon's got no other exit." But Talon smiled grimly in the darkness. "He's wrong," he whispered so quietly Maria could barely hear. "There's always another way, if you know where to look." The riders spent what felt like hours searching the canyon, probably only minutes. Maria could hear their horses moving back and forth, their voices echoing off the walls as they called to each other. Finally, their sounds began to fade as they moved deeper into the canyon, following the false trail Talon had somehow laid. "Now," Talon whispered, leading her back out of the alcove. But instead of continuing deeper into the canyon, he led her to what looked like a solid wall of rock. Up close, Maria could see it was actually a cleverly concealed entrance to another passage so narrow they would have to move single file. "On the hidden way," Talon said. "My people used this to escape when the cavalry thought they had us trapped." They squeezed through the narrow opening into a passage that seemed to lead upward through the heart of the mountain. The air grew cooler as they climbed, and Maria could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. "Where does this lead?" she asked. "To the high caves," Talon replied. "Sacred place where my ancestors went to speak with the spirits. But more importantly, it has 3 different exits. Even if they find one, we can escape through another." They climbed for what felt like hours, the passage sometimes widening into small chambers, sometimes narrowing until they had to crawl. Maria's hands were raw from the rough stone, and her injured shoulder throbbed with each movement. But gradually, she began to see light ahead. Not torchlight, but the gray gleam of dawn filtering down from above. The passage was leading them up to the surface, but from inside the mountain rather than through the canyon below. They emerged onto a high plateau hidden among the peaks, surrounded by towering rock formations that concealed them from view. Dawn was breaking over the Colorado plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. "The sacred ground," Talon said, gesturing to the ancient fire rings and carved symbols that dotted the plateau. "My people have come here for 1,000 years when they needed the spirit's guidance." Maria looked around at the hidden sanctuary, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since leaving New York. But even as she tried to catch her breath, she knew their ordeal was far from over. "They'll keep looking," she said. "Cyrus won't give up." Talon agreed. "He won't. But up here we have advantages he doesn't know about." He led her to one of the ancient fire rings and began gathering dried wood that had been left by previous visitors. As he worked, he explained their situation. "Cyrus operates with impunity because he has protection, paid officials, corrupt lawmen, politicians who look the other way. But even protected men have enemies." "What kind of enemies?" "The kind who would pay well for evidence of what he's been doing." Talon said simply. Names, dates, details that could bring down his entire operation. Maria thought about what she'd overheard that morning, the casual way Cyrus had discussed his business with Helen. Helen would have records. She's the kind of woman who writes everything down. Then we need to get those records, Talon said. Are you insane? Go back to the farm. That's exactly where they'll be looking. Which is why they won't expect us to return, he replied. Sometimes the most dangerous place is also the safest. As if to underscore his point, and the sound of horses echoing through the valleys below reached their ears. Cyrus's men were still searching, but they were looking in all the wrong places. But as they prepared to descend from the sacred plateau, a new complication emerged. Smoke was rising from the direction of the Harrow farm, not the thin smoke of cooking fires, but the thick, black smoke of buildings burning. No. Maria whispered, understanding immediately what was happening. Cyrus Black was destroying the evidence himself. The descent from the sacred plateau was treacherous in daylight, requiring them to move carefully along narrow ledges and steep slopes that would have been invisible in darkness. But Talon led the way, with confidence following paths known only to his people for generations. The smoke, Maria said as they climbed down. If the farm is burning, the records might be destroyed. Talon finished grimly. Or Cyrus might be forcing Helen to give them up before he kills her. The thought sent ice through Maria's veins. Whatever Helen had done, whatever crimes she had committed, she was still Sarah's mother. And Sarah, gentle, kind Sarah, was still at that farm, probably trapped by the same fire that was destroying the evidence they needed. We have to help them, Maria said. We will, Talon replied. But we need to be smart about it. Cyrus will have men watching every approach to the farm. As they reached the bottom of the mountain and began making their way across the valley toward the growing smoke, they encountered their first surprise. Fletcher Morrison was riding hard toward the farm, but he wasn't alone. Dr. Hayes was with him, along with two other men Maria didn't recognize. Get down, Talon hissed, pulling Maria behind a cluster of sagebrush. They watched as the group of riders approached, and Maria's heart sank as she realized the truth. Fletcher Morrison, the kind old rancher who had always been courteous to her, was working with Cyrus Black. Well, well, Fletcher called out as the riders drew near their hiding spot. Looks like our little birds decided to come home to roost. Maria felt the world tilt around her. Fletcher Morrison, who had seemed so concerned about her welfare, was leading Cyrus's men directly to them. Come on out, girl. Fletcher continued, his voice carrying a new hardness she'd never heard before. No point in making this harder than it has to be. Beside her, Talon was reaching for his knife, but the odds were impossible. 4 armed men against the 2 of them, and nowhere to run. I know you're there. Dr. Hayes called out, his medical bag gleaming in the morning light. And I know you're hurt from that climb. Let me take a look at those cuts on your hands. The casual mention of her injuries sent ice through Maria's veins. How could he know about the cuts unless he'd been watching, waiting, planning this moment? Why? Maria called out, rising slowly from behind the sagebrush with her hands visible. Why are you doing this? Fletcher dismounted, his weathered face showing no trace of the kindness she remembered. Because some of us learned long ago that fighting the current just gets you drowned. Cyrus pays well for information, and times have been hard. And you, Doctor? Maria asked, looking at Hayes. What's your excuse? Medical supplies are expensive. Hayes replied with a shrug. Especially the kind that don't ask questions. Cyrus has been a valuable patron for years. But even as Fletcher spoke, Maria caught a flicker of something in his eyes, not the cold calculation she expected, but something that looked almost like regret. Tie her up, Fletcher ordered one of his companions. Cyrus wants her delivered intact. As the man approached with rope, Maria made her decision. She wouldn't go quietly into slavery. When the man reached for her wrists, she drove her knee upward as hard as she could. He doubled over with a grunt of pain, and in that moment of confusion, talons struck from the darkness. His knife found the throat of the second stranger before the man could draw his gun, and suddenly the odds had shifted dramatically. "Run!" Talon shouted as he grappled with Fletcher for the old rancher's weapon. But Maria had spotted something that changed everything. Dr. Hayes was reaching into his medical bag, not for a weapon, but for a small brown bottle she recognized. Laudanum. He was planning to drug her to make her transport easier. Instead of running, Maria dove for Hayes's horse. The animal reared up in surprise, hooves flashing dangerously close to the doctor's head. He stumbled backward, dropping both his bag and the bottle, which shattered against a rock. "Ah, you little bitch." Hayes snarled, his professional demeanor cracking to reveal the monster beneath. "Do you have any idea how much that cost?" But Fletcher suddenly broke free from Talon's grip, his weathered face now showing open anguish. "Stop!" he shouted, not at Maria and Talon, but at Dr. Hayes. "This has gone far enough." The remaining gunman raised his weapon, but Fletcher knocked it aside. "I said stop." "What the hell, Fletcher?" Hayes demanded. "We had a deal." "The deal was to watch the girl, not to hurt her." Fletcher said, his voice heavy with shame. I thought if I could keep track of her movements, I could find a way to help her escape." "But you're talking about drugging her about—" "You old fool," Hayes interrupted. "Did you really think Cyrus would let you play both sides forever?" The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. Fletcher hadn't been betraying her, he'd been trying to protect her while maintaining his cover as one of Cyrus's informants. But there was no time to process this information. The sound of more horses approaching from multiple directions announced that Cyrus had been thorough in his planning, positioning men throughout the area to prevent exactly this kind of escape attempt. "The burning farm," Talon said suddenly. "That's not just destruction, it's a signal. Cyrus is calling in all his men." They could see riders converging from every direction, at least a dozen armed men closing in on their position. The sacred mountains that had provided refuge in darkness now offered no concealment in the harsh light of day. "There," Fletcher said, pointing toward a rocky outcropping about a quarter-mile away. "Old mine shaft hidden in those rocks. It connects to a whole network of abandoned tunnels." "You're coming with us," Maria said, grabbing Fletcher's arm. "If you really want to help, now's your chance." Fletcher nodded grimly, then turned to face Dr. Hayes. "I'm sorry, Benjamin. I truly am." Before Hayes could respond, Fletcher struck him with the butt of his rifle, dropping the treacherous doctor unconscious to the ground. "That's for all the girls you helped disappear over the years." They ran across the open ground, Fletcher and Talon supporting Maria between them, as her injured shoulder began to give out. Behind them, shouts erupted as Cyrus's converging forces spotted their movement. The mine entrance was concealed behind a rock fall that looked natural, but had been carefully arranged. Fletcher led them through a gap barely wide enough for a single person into a shaft that descended steeply into the earth. "This was my grandfather's claim," Fletcher explained as they moved into the darkness. "Played out years ago, but the tunnels run for miles underground. Some of them connect to active mines, others come out in hidden valleys 20 miles from here. The descent into the mine was like entering another world. The darkness was absolute, except for the faint light filtering down from the entrance, and the air grew colder with each step. Maria could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance, and the sound of their footsteps echoed off unseen walls. "Stay close," Fletcher warned. "Some of these side passages drop straight down into flooded chambers. One wrong step and you'll never be found." They moved through the maze of passages, Fletcher leading with the confidence of someone who had explored these depths as a child. Behind them, they could hear their pursuers at the mine entrance. But the sound grew fainter as they went deeper. But as they moved deeper into the tunnel system, disaster struck. The floor gave way beneath Maria's feet, rotten timbers collapsing under her weight. She fell with a scream that echoed through the tunnels, landing hard on a pile of broken rock 15 feet below. "Maria," Talon's voice came from above, tight with concern. "I'm alive," she called back, though her left arm was throbbing with renewed pain. "But I'm trapped down here." "Can you climb?" Fletcher asked. Maria looked up at the sheer walls of the pit she'd fallen into, then at her useless left arm. "No. You'll have to find another way down. There isn't another way down to where you are," Fletcher said grimly. "But there might be another way out. Those rocks you're lying on, they're covering another tunnel." Maria began shifting the fallen stones with her good arm, biting back cries of pain when the movement jarred her injured shoulder. Gradually, she uncovered what looked like the entrance to yet another passage. "I found something," she called up. "Follow it," Talon said. "We'll try to find another way to reach you." Maria crawled into the new tunnel using the faint light from above to guide her. The passage was narrow and low, forcing her to move on hands and knees, and every movement sent fire through her injured shoulder. But as she crawled forward, she began to see something that made her blood run cold, not light, but the flicker of torches approaching from ahead. Someone else was in the tunnels, and they were coming her way. She pressed herself against the tunnel wall, trying to become invisible in the darkness. The torchlight grew brighter, and she could hear voices echoing off the stone walls. "She's got to be down here somewhere," a man was saying. "Boss wants her alive, but he didn't say she had to be in one piece." "Look careful," another voice replied. "These old mines are unstable. One wrong step and we'll all be buried down here." Maria realized with growing horror that Cyrus's men had found another entrance to the tunnel system. They were coming at her from both directions, and she was trapped in the middle with nowhere to run. But as the torchlight got closer, she noticed something the approaching men hadn't seen. The tunnel she was in didn't just run straight. There was a narrow side passage, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. She worked her way into the cramped space just as the first torchbearer came into view. Through a crack in the rock, she could see 3 of Cyrus's men moving cautiously through the main tunnel, their weapons drawn and their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. "Blood on the rocks here," one of them said, stopping almost directly above where Maria was hiding. "She's hurt. Can't have gone far." They continued past her hiding place, their torchlight fading as they moved deeper into the tunnels. Maria waited until she couldn't hear their voices anymore, then began working her way through the narrow side passage. The cramped space seemed to go on forever, forcing her to crawl through sections so tight she could barely move her shoulders. But gradually, she began to see light ahead, not torchlight, but the gray gleam of daylight filtering down from above. She emerged from a crack in the rocks about a mile from the main mine entrance, gasping in the fresh air. In the distance, she could see riders searching the area around the mine, but they hadn't spotted her exit point. But her relief was short-lived. As she tried to get her bearings, she heard a sound that made her heart stop, the clip-clop of a single horse approaching at a steady walk. Cyrus Black rode into view, his pale eyes scanning the landscape with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. When he spotted Maria crouched among the rocks, his thin lips curved into a cold smile. "End of the line, little bird," he said, drawing his revolver with deliberate care. "Time to pay the price for all this trouble you've caused." Maria's hand instinctively went to Anna's bracelet, the small silver sparrow charm warm against her wrist. Her sister's voice echoed in her memory. "Freedom is worth dying for." But as Cyrus raised his weapon, Maria noticed something glinting in the rubble at her feet, a stick of dynamite left behind by long-dead miners, along with a tin of matches wrapped in oiled cloth. "Stay back," she warned, holding up the dynamite. "One spark and we both die." Cyrus laughed, but she caught a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You think I'm afraid of some foreign girl with a stick of old dynamite? That stuff's probably too degraded to explode." "Want to test that theory?" Maria asked, striking a match. For the first time since she'd known him, Cyrus Black looked uncertain. The flame of the match reflected in his pale eyes, and she could see him calculating odds. But before either of them could make another move, a new voice cut through the tension. "Drop your weapon, Cyrus." Federal Marshal Patterson emerged from behind a boulder, his badge glinting in the morning sun and his rifle trained on Cyrus's chest. Behind him came Talon and Fletcher, along with several other men. Maria didn't recognize federal agents, she realized, who had been tracking Cyrus's operation for months. "Patterson." Cyrus said, his voice carefully controlled. "Didn't expect to see you out here." "I'll bet you didn't," Patterson replied grimly. "Especially since you thought you had me in your pocket." A cold smile played across Cyrus's lips. "I do have you in my pocket. Check your bank account lately, Marshal. See any unusual deposits?" Patterson's expression didn't change, but Maria caught something in his eyes, a flicker of satisfaction that suggested he'd been expecting this moment. "Oh, I've been checking my accounts very carefully," Patterson said. "Every deposit, every withdrawal. Very interesting records. Very incriminating records." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that we've been building a case against you for over a year. Every payment you made to corrupt officials, every bribe, every threat, we have it all documented." Cyrus's face went white as understanding dawned. "You've been working undercover. Federal agents have been infiltrating your network from the beginning," Patterson confirmed. "The young woman you've been chasing, she was never just a runaway slave. She was bait." Maria stared at Patterson in shock. "Bait? We knew Cyrus would come for you personally if you caused enough trouble," Patterson explained. "It was the only way to get him away from his protected strongholds and into a position where we could arrest him." But Cyrus wasn't finished. With a snarl of rage, he spurred his horse forward, raising his gun not at Patterson or the other agents, but at Maria herself. "If I'm going down, she's coming with me." The shot that rang out across the valley was deafeningly loud, but it wasn't Cyrus who fired. Sarah Harrow stood on a ridge 50 yards away, Fletcher's hunting rifle smoking in her hands and tears streaming down her face. Cyrus looked down at the spreading stain on his shirt with an expression of mild surprise, then toppled from his horse into the dust. "I couldn't let him hurt you," Sarah said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't let him hurt anyone else." As Cyrus lay dying in the Colorado dirt, his pale eyes fixed on Maria one last time. "This doesn't end with me?" he gasped. "There are others. The network. It goes deeper than you know." His voice trailed off, and the most feared man in Colorado territory breathed his last, brought down by a 19-year-old girl who had finally found the courage to fight. But even as Patterson's men began securing the scene and tending to the wounded, Maria realized their victory came with a terrible cost. In the distance, thick smoke still rose from the Harrow farm, carrying with it years of carefully documented evidence. And somewhere in that smoke, Helen Harrow's secrets were burning away, along with the names and details that could have brought down Cyrus's entire network. The war was far from over. The ruins of the Harrow farmhouse still smoldered as the federal agents picked through the debris, searching for anything that might have survived the fire. Maria stood watching with Talon, Sarah, and Fletcher, all of them understanding that crucial evidence had literally gone up in smoke. "Anything," Patterson called to one of his men, who was sifting through the ashes of what had been Helen's bedroom. "Strongbox was opened before the fire," the agent replied. "Looks like someone cleaned it out, then torched the place." Sarah wiped her eyes with a soot-stained handkerchief. "Ma and John took a wagon toward Mexico yesterday afternoon. Soon as they heard the shooting start, they loaded up and ran. They took the records with them," Maria said grimly. "Maybe not all of them," Fletcher said thoughtfully. "Helen was suspicious by nature. She might have kept copies hidden somewhere else." "Where?" Patterson asked. Fletcher gestured toward the barn, which had only been partially damaged by the fire. When I was courting Helen's sister 20 years ago, she told me Helen kept important papers in a hidden cache under the barn. Said it was Helen's insurance policy. They made their way to the barn, where Fletcher led them to a seemingly ordinary section of the floor. But when he pried up one of the planks, it revealed a waterproof metal box hidden beneath. "Well, I'll be damned," Patterson said as Fletcher pulled out the box. She really did keep copies. Inside were ledgers, correspondence, and detailed records going back 5 years. Names of buyers, descriptions of victims, financial transactions, everything they needed to roll up the rest of Cyrus's network. But as Patterson examined the documents, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is worse than we thought," he said finally. "The operation extends far beyond Colorado territory. There are buyers from California to Texas connections to politicians and judges we never suspected." "What about the women who are still being held?" Sarah asked. "The ones who are alive but trapped. We'll find them," Patterson promised. "But it's going to take time, and it's going to be dangerous." As if to underscore his words, one of the federal agents approached with disturbing news. "Marshal, we found Dr. Hayes's body about 2 miles from here. Throat cut. And 3 of our men found evidence of a camp where someone spent the night watching the farm." Cyrus wasn't working alone, Patterson realized. Someone else was here, someone who escaped when we closed in. The thought sent a chill through Maria. Even with Cyrus dead, there were others out there who would want revenge for the disruption of their profitable business. "We need to get these women to safety," Fletcher said, gesturing toward Maria and Sarah. "If there are other members of the network still operating." But before Patterson could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses. A lone rider was coming fast across the prairie, pushing his mount to the limit. The rider was a young man. Maria didn't recognize his clothes, travel-stained, and his face etched with exhaustion. He reined in his lathered horse and addressed Patterson directly. "Marshal," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "Message from Denver. Federal office says it's urgent." Patterson took the sealed envelope and broke it open, his face growing pale as he read. "Damn," he said quietly. "What is it?" Talon asked. 3 more operations were hit last night." Patterson replied grimly. "Mining camps in Leadville, Central City, and Georgetown. Whoever's running things now, they're moving fast to eliminate evidence and relocate their captives." "Elena," Maria said suddenly. "The girl Helen mentioned, she was supposed to be in Leadville." "We'll check," Patterson promised. "But first, we need to secure the witnesses we have. There are people who won't be happy about what happened here today." As if summoned by his words, another complication emerged from an unexpected direction. A woman appeared on foot from the direction of town, walking with determined purpose, despite her obvious exhaustion. As she got closer, Maria recognized her with a shock. It was Elena herself, the girl who was supposed to be trapped in a mining camp near Leadville. But she wasn't alone. Behind her came 3 other women, all showing signs of long captivity, but now moving with the purposeful stride of people who had tasted freedom. "Elena," Sarah called out, running toward the approaching group. "Sarah," Elena replied, embracing the younger woman. "Thank God you're safe. When we heard about the fire—" "How did you escape?" Maria asked. Elena's expression darkened. "We didn't escape. We were freed by someone working from the inside. Someone who's been planning this for a long time." She gestured toward one of the other women, a thin blonde who moved with nervous energy. "This is Rebecca. She's been working for the federal marshals for 6 months, gathering evidence." Patterson looked stunned. "Rebecca Norton. But you were reported as a trafficking victim." "I was," Rebecca replied grimly. "But when Marshal Williams recruited me, I agreed to go back undercover. It was the only way to gather the evidence you needed from the inside." "Williams," Patterson's voice was sharp with suspicion. "There's no Marshall Williams in our Denver office." Rebecca's face went white. But he had credentials, a badge? The truth hit Maria like a physical blow. "You've been working for them," she said. "For the trafficking network. They sent you to spy on us." Rebecca stepped backward, her hand moving toward something concealed beneath her jacket. "You don't understand. I had to. They have my sister, my real sister. They said if I didn't cooperate—" "Where is she?" Elena demanded. "Where's your sister?" "I don't know," Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. "They move the girls constantly. I haven't seen her in months." The standoff was broken by Fletcher, who had been watching Rebecca's movements carefully. "Easy, girl," he said in the same tone he might use to calm a spooked horse. "Nobody here wants to hurt you. We just want to help." "You can't help," Rebecca replied desperately. "Don't you understand? Cyrus was just one man in a network that stretches across half the country. You killed him, but there are others. And now they know about all of you." As if to underscore her words, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the valley. Patterson's agents, who had been posted as sentries around the farm, were under attack. "Ambush," Talon said grimly, already moving toward the horses. "They've been waiting for us to gather in one place." "How many?" Patterson asked, checking his rifle. "At least a dozen riders." Fletcher replied, using his spyglass to scan the surrounding hills. "Professional gunmen, not local farmhands. They've got us surrounded." Maria looked around at the people who had become her unlikely family, Sarah, who had found courage she never knew she possessed. Talon, who had risked everything to help a stranger. Fletcher, who had redeemed himself through sacrifice. Elena and the other rescued women who carried the scars of unimaginable suffering. They had come so far, fought so hard, only to find themselves trapped again by the very network they thought they had defeated. But as the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She stood up Anna's bracelet, catching the afternoon sunlight, and faced the approaching threat with the calm determination of someone who had finally learned the true meaning of freedom. "Rebecca," she said quietly, "if your sister is really out there, if she's really still alive, then we're going to find her. All of us. Together." "But they'll kill us," Rebecca whispered. "Maybe," Maria replied. "But some things are worth dying for, and some fights are too important to walk away from." As the first shots rang out across the Colorado plains, Maria Volkov, the girl who had once knelt helpless in the dust, drew Fletcher's spare pistol and prepared to make her final stand. The price of freedom, she had learned, was eternal vigilance. But freedom itself was worth everything. The battle for the future was about to begin. Epilogue. 2 years later, Maria stood in the federal courthouse in Denver, her testimony having just helped convict the last known member of Cyrus Black's trafficking network. Beside her, Elena gripped her hand tightly, both women bearing the scars of their ordeals, but standing tall with the dignity of survivors. 23 operations shut down. Marshal Patterson reported to the crowded courtroom. 87 women freed, and a network stretching from California to Texas finally brought to justice. The battle at the Harrow farm had been costly. 3 federal agents had died in the ambush, along with 2 of the attacking gunmen. Fletcher Morrison had taken a bullet in the shoulder, but survived to see justice done. Rebecca had proven her loyalty in the end, using her knowledge of the network's operations to help track down the remaining criminals. But the victory had come at a personal cost that Maria still carried with her. Helen and John Harrow had been found dead in Mexico, apparently killed by associates who feared they might talk. Dr. Hayes had died in the tunnels, shot by his own accomplices, when they realized he was more liability than asset. "What happens to us now?" Elena asked as they left the courthouse. "We keep fighting," Maria replied. "There are other networks out there, other women who need help. The Western Women's Aid Society is just the beginning. Sarah approached them now, working as an advocate for trafficking victims and carrying herself with confidence that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. She had used her inheritance from the farm's sale to fund their organization, turning her family's legacy of exploitation into a force for liberation. "There's a telegram for you," Sarah said, handing Maria an envelope. "From a group of women in San Francisco. They want to meet with us about expanding our network." Maria smiled as she read the telegram. What had started as one woman's desperate fight for freedom was becoming a movement that could change countless lives. "Ready for another adventure?" Talon asked, appearing at her side. He wore a federal marshal's badge, now using his unique skills to track down traffickers throughout the territory. They had been married in a simple ceremony the previous spring, their partnership in work extending naturally into their personal lives. "Always." Maria replied, then looked around at the friends who had become her family. But together this time. Always together. Rebecca joined them, her sister safely recovered from a mining camp in Utah, and both women now working to help other victims rebuild their lives. The network of exploitation had been larger and more complex than any of them had imagined, but it had also proven vulnerable when faced with the determination of ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things. As they walked away from the courthouse, past the crowds of reporters and supporters who had gathered to hear the verdicts, Maria thought about her sister Anna's final words. "Find freedom, little sparrow, whatever it costs." The cost had been higher than Anna could have imagined. Months of terror, nights of despair, moments when death seemed preferable to captivity. But freedom, true freedom, wasn't just about escaping your own chains. It was about making sure those chains could never be forged again. In her office that evening, Maria sat down to write her weekly letter to the other branches of the Western Women's Aid Society. Each letter carried the same message: we are here, we are watching, and we will not let this happen again. But tonight's letter was different. Tonight she had news that would change everything. "My dear friends," she wrote, "I am pleased to inform you that Congress has passed the Federal Anti-Trafficking Act, making the transportation of women across state lines for purposes of forced labor or prostitution a federal crime punishable by 20 years in prison. It is a victory that belongs to all of us, to every woman who found the courage to speak out, to every man who chose to stand with us, to every survivor who refused to let their suffering be in vain." She paused in her writing, looking out the window at the lights of Denver twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there, other women were fighting their own battles against exploitation and abuse. But now they had laws to protect them, organizations to support them, and a growing network of allies who understood that freedom was not a gift, but a right. The little sparrow had learned to fly, and now she was teaching others to soar. Thunder rumbled across the Colorado sky, promising rain to break the long drought. Change was coming to the territory, carried on the winds of justice and the courage of people who had chosen to make a difference. And Maria Volkov, once a terrified girl kneeling in the dust, now walked toward that storm with her head held high, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The price of freedom was eternal vigilance, but it was a price she was willing to pay. For herself, for Anna, for Elena and Sarah and Rebecca, and for all the women who would never have to kneel in the dust again. The end. The Western Women's Aid Society operated for 25 years, helping to rescue over 400 women from trafficking situations and leading to the passage of some of the first comprehensive federal anti-trafficking laws in American history. Maria Volkov died peacefully in 1923 at the age of 69, surrounded by the dozens of women whose lives she had helped save. Her memoir, The Price of Freedom, became a cornerstone text for the women's rights movement and inspired generations of activists. Sarah Harrow became a prominent suffragette and social reformer, using her family's story as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of desperation and the redemptive power of courage. Elena founded schools for trafficking survivors in 4 states, and Talon Little Raven became the first Native American to serve as a federal marshal in Colorado Territory. Rebecca Norton and her sister established a safe house network that helped hundreds of women escape abusive situations, proving that even those who had been exploited could become powerful advocates for change. None of them lived to see all their dreams fulfilled, but they lived long enough to know their fight had not been in vain. The networks of exploitation they battled were weakened and exposed, forced to operate in shadows rather than broad daylight. Most importantly, they proved that ordinary people, a seamstress, a farm girl, a displaced warrior, a handful of honest officials could stand against systematic injustice and win. Their legacy lived on in every woman who refused to accept that her life was not her own, in every person who chose to help rather than look away, in every law that protected the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. The price of freedom, they learned, was eternal vigilance. But freedom itself was worth everything.